He's alive, Obi-Wan.
Promise me you will train the boy.
If you're not with me, then you're my enemy. Don't make me kill you. I see through the lies of the Jedi.
Anakin Skywalker is alive.
He's coming, Master. It's been said that comparison is the thief of joy, a statement I found to be especially true in the world of 3D printing and prop making. Have you ever made something that you were genuinely proud of, something you poured countless time and effort into completing? If so, then I'm sure you're familiar with that immediate feeling of pride and triumph that follows. And for a moment, it's enough. But then, a few scrolls of social media later, those feelings begin to change. You see someone else's work, their talent, their quality, when suddenly that triumph you once felt turns to judgment. What once felt like pride now doesn't feel good enough. You become your worst critic, as each mistake and inaccuracy become the focal point of what you've created. While unhealthy comparison is a huge reason why I decided to make this helmet to begin with, I learned a very valuable lesson along the way. A lesson that challenges the aforementioned quote. While it is true that comparison can be the thief of joy, I'm here to tell you it doesn't have to be. My hope is that by the end of this video, you'll come to understand why. I don't normally talk in great detail about the 3D printing aspect of my builds. I feel as though the information on how to 3D print is plentiful, oversaturated even. Having said that, I struggled a great deal when printing this helmet, for reasons that were my own doing, as well as issues with the model itself. I like to be open and honest about my mistakes and struggles in these videos, and the issues I faced when printing are no less worthy of inclusion than any other issue I faced throughout this build, so I figured I'd share them with you. This helmet is a relatively new file made by Levy 3D, which can be purchased on the Wireframe 3D website. What made this helmet so unique in concept ended up being quite the headache in reality. The helmet splits apart at the chin just like the on-screen helmet does. For reasons unknown, the V1 version of the helmet didn't align properly, an issue that other makers were experiencing as well. Thus, an absurd amount of modification would have to be done in order for the pieces to align. That issue has since been fixed, but another issue was introduced in the process. When printing the lower chin section, any changes to the orientation of the model resulted in this weird 45-degree bevel to appear on only one of the pipes. The helmet has since received several updates, however I'm unsure whether or not the specific issue has been fixed. So if you print this helmet for yourself, be on the lookout for that. If it happens to you, be sure to print this part at the default orientation in your slicer. I wasn't out of the woods yet, however. The belts on my K1 Max were improperly tensioned, resulting in multiple failed prints due to layer shifts. In my haste, I put off doing the necessary maintenance on the K1, and instead split the face of the helmet into two parts, which were printed on smaller printers, then welded together. Meanwhile, when printing the dome, my Anycubic Cobra Max took a page out of Padme's book and lost the will to live at 70% completion. It has since been retired. I was well overdue for an upgrade anyways, so I've since replaced it with a Neptune 4 Max, which printed the dome with no issues. I think I may have streamlined my sanding process in the making of this helmet, and I'm confident in saying that this is the fastest I've sanded a helmet of this size. A quick overview of this process is as follows. I start with a round of power sanding to deal with the major imperfections. I then fill gaps and depressions with products like Bondo and UV resin. I then spray 2 to 3 coats of U-Pull High Build Primer, which is great for removing layer lines. The remainder of time is spent spraying coats of Duplicolor Filler Primer and sanding interchangeably until it's smooth enough to paint. Lately, I've been using UV resin a lot more to smooth my prints, which is part of how I was able to sand this helmet as quickly as I did. I have a really bad set it and forget it problem during the sanding phase. It's very common for me to spray a coat of filler primer or apply some filler, then instead of returning an hour or so later to continue sanding, I often get distracted and don't return until several hours or even the following day in some cases. So needless to say, it takes me a lot longer to finish projects than it otherwise should. The best part about using resin is how quickly you're able to progress. Since resin cures instantly, it can be sanded right away, allowing you to fill many imperfections in quick succession. A little bit of resin goes a long way, and mixing in small amounts of baby powder will result in a thicker consistency, which allows you to fill deeper voids that normal resin may not be able to. Always remember that when working with resin, be sure to wear proper gloves, a respirator, and if possible, work in a well-ventilated area. Moving on to the high build primer. I'm using U-Pull System 20, which is a 4:1 mix ratio, that being 4 parts primer to 1 part hardener. Since the helmet was mostly smooth going into this stage, I reduced it with 1 part urethane reducer, which makes it a primer surfacer instead. I personally just prefer the flow of this primer when reduced. It goes down smooth as butter and sands much more easily. Plus it still does a really good job at filling imperfections, which is what matters most. After laying down the first coat, I allow it to flash for about 10 to 15 minutes before applying the final coat. I waited a full 24 hours before wet sanding with 320 grit. After a coat of Duplicolor filler primer, the results you're seeing now is what this helmet looked like only 2 days into sanding. By comparison, it usually takes me upwards of a week in order for a build of this size to be at this stage in the sanding process. It took me just under 7 days to fully smooth this helmet, with a total of 11 hours being spent sanding. At this point, the helmet was primed and has been wet sanded with 400 grit sandpaper. Surface preparation is key, so prior to painting, the helmet was wiped down with IPA, and any handling of the helmet was only done so while wearing gloves. The final thing I do right before painting is to wipe the surface with a tack rag to remove any debris. I've been challenging myself recently to not use spray paint nearly as much, and to instead experiment with alternative methods. In preparation for this helmet, I picked up an HVLP touch-up gun from Harbor Freight for only $15, and has a 0.6mm nozzle. For comparison, my airbrush, that being an Iwata Eclipse, has a 0.35mm nozzle. So this gun can technically serve as a glorified airbrush with nearly double the coverage. There's many options to consider as far as what paints to use. I was curious to see how well airbrush paint would work, so I used Vallejo's black surface primer. I mixed together a large volume of paint that was reduced 50-50 with airbrush thinner, plus a few parts of flow improver. I sprayed at 20 psi with the fan control and fluid control both wide open, and I gotta say, I was blown away at how well this ended up working out. This was probably one of the cleanest base coats I've ever applied. The main reason I decided to take this approach on this portion of the helmet is that I wanted the base coat to be as smooth as possible. That way when I clear coat it, there's less chance the clear would need to be wet sanded and corrected. The base coat had a few pieces of lint that were bothering me, so I decided to wet sand them out using 2000 grit sandpaper. Once the surface imperfections were removed, the next step was to apply a clear coat. I once again prepped the surface of both parts the same way I showed previously. I had a pretty embarrassing and disturbing realization during the making of this helmet. I've been experiencing an issue for quite some time when spraying high build primer or clear coat. The flow of paint would start out fine at first, but would gradually decrease throughout my paint sessions. After going back to square one and approaching the use of my spray gun from the perspective of a complete beginner, I realized I've been completely overlooking an essential step when cleaning the gun. The air vent at the top of the paint cup was clogged with high build primer and has been clogged for what I can only assume has been several months. This clog prevents air intake, thus creating a vacuum, therefore restricting the flow of paint. So basically, every project where I've used high build primer or 2K clear on these past few months have been compromised, and the quality of those paint applications were greatly affected as a result of this. Which means that this helmet you're seeing now is the first time in a long time that this gun has been operating at its full potential. After removing the clog, I began spraying clear on these parts, and the results I was getting were incredible. Or at least, they were, because it wouldn't be a video of mine without something going horribly wrong. brace yourself. I swear to you guys, I'm not doing this on purpose. I shouldn't have been spraying from bottom to top. You can even see slight hesitation in my movements prior to doing it, but for whatever reason, I still did, and this is what happened. I have a tendency to be pretty careless when it comes to properly securing the things I paint, though I can assure you I've since taken steps to ensure that something like this won't happen again, or at the very least is less likely to happen again. The show must go on, however, so I went ahead and applied my third and final coat on the last surviving part. As for the part that fell, I would have to wait a full 24 hours before I can properly handle it and assess the damage. As easy as it would be to fix this off camera and continue on as though it never happened, I believe that tutorials without transparency are worthless. In my experience, gravity favors no one. We drop things, they break. And it can just as easily happen to any of you watching. So I think it's a really good opportunity to stop for a second and go over how to fix something like this. After inspecting the damage, I realized I wasn't so lucky this time around, as the paint was severely chipped in several spots. Large pieces of debris were embedded in the clear, and depressions were formed in the spots that made contact with the floor upon impact. Perhaps the most depressing part of it all is that this part didn't even need to be clear coated to begin with. This entire part will soon be painted entirely with a satin metallic gray, which if anything benefits more from a flat black base coat instead of a glossy one. I honestly have no idea what I was thinking. Regardless, it still needs to be repaired. To start, I wet sanded the entire surface, making sure to remove or at least smooth the pieces of debris that were stuck to the surface. I then used a very fine 3M Scotch-Brite pad to scuff the surface. The goal here is to provide better adhesion for when I reapply my base coat. To fill the spots where the paint was damaged, I mixed together some Bondo and acetone to increase its workability and filled the damaged areas with a brush. Once the Bondo was sanded smooth, I used an airbrush to reapply the base coat. If this part did require a clear coat, that would be reattempted now. Since it doesn't, this part can be set aside until it's time to be painted. As for the upper portion of the face, I was really happy with the results, so no further post-processing was needed. Jumping back to the dome, I ended up using a Rust-Oleum Satin Black as a base. Due to the size of this part, I didn't feel as though it would be efficient to paint it using the same Vallejo paint from earlier. My thought process was that this part would require wet sanding and polishing after the fact regardless, so it was of no difference to me. Throughout the course of this build, I've been researching ways to improve my technique and the quality of my work. I've come to realize that the way I've been spraying clear isn't as optimized as it could be. After analyzing my own footage from this paint session you're seeing now, as well as previous projects, I've noticed I consistently spray too far away, my PSI is oftentimes too high, my fluid control is set too high, and my fan control is wider than it probably should be. I've since made the necessary adjustments to my gun, as well as my technique. I do get a chance at a later point in this video to showcase those recent changes, but there's no need to spoil when or why that is. You'll know when we get there. When it came time to paint the helmet, accuracy and attention to detail were my top priority. Earlier when I spoke of unhealthy comparison, I mentioned how it was a contributing factor to me making this helmet to begin with. I've come to realize that I made several mistakes in my last video, where I made a damaged Darth Vader helmet, also from the Kenobi series. While I did spend an inordinate amount of time researching and testing different paint combinations in order to best replicate the colors of the screen-used helmet, I failed to apply an equal amount of time ensuring that each facet of the helmet was painted correctly. So here are the mistakes that I made. This section underneath the lens is supposed to be black. This section on one of the cheeks is supposed to be metallic gray. This entire section above the pipes is supposed to be gray, and this inner triangle between the pipes is supposed to be black. While I'm still extremely content with how this project turned out, these inaccuracies have proven to be strong motivators to ensure this helmet you're seeing now is painted without error. A great reference I used during this build was a video on Adam Savage's Tested channel, where he gets a behind-the-scenes look at the screen-used suit for the Kenobi series. This video has been the holy grail for me and other Vader enthusiasts alike. Being able to see the details up close, in studio lighting, was extremely helpful when it came time to paint. Since most metallic paints naturally have a glossy finish, the biggest obstacle during my last build, and by extension this build, was figuring out a way to tone down the sheen of the metallic paint in order to achieve the desired finish, while also retaining a metallic appearance. I can't put into words how much time, energy, and mental capacity was exerted in order to figure this out. Luckily, I wasn't alone in doing so. A fellow maker who goes by 19props on Instagram, someone who I view as a mentor, a co-collaborator, but most importantly, a really good friend, was simultaneously trying to figure out a solution to this on his own OWK build. After what must have been weeks and transcripts upon transcripts of us sharing our findings, bouncing ideas off one another, becoming completely obsessed with our work, we both found our own unique methods of achieving this finish. I used Vallejo's Steel Color from their Metallic Colors line of paints as my base, then sealed it with Vallejo's Matte Varnish, with results being very accurate to the screen-used helmet. If you don't own an airbrush, but are still interested in making this helmet for yourself, then I would highly recommend checking out the method that 19props used. He was able to achieve his metallic gray using graphite powder and a series of different clear coats. A link to his Instagram will be in the description of this video. He's a great guy and is more than willing to answer any and all questions you may have. After 2 hours and 40 minutes of painstakingly applying the masking tape, I applied the metallic gray onto both portions of the face. The biggest tip I can offer when masking is to use the right type of tape. For me, 3M vinyl masking tape is an absolute must. This technique, while it looks good, isn't the most durable, as the paint located in the collision areas where the two parts attach are very susceptible to chipping. I plan on doing some more testing in the future to figure out ways to better protect this finish, but for now it's plenty durable for display purposes. It's been well over 24 hours since ClearCoat was applied to the dome. As you can see, there's some noticeable orange peel, as well as some surface imperfections. I've talked in great detail in my previous Vader helmet videos about the correction process moving forward. In short, we wet sand to remove orange peel and major imperfections, using 1000 grit sandpaper, working our way up to 3000 grit sandpaper. We then polish the helmet to remove minor scratches and defects, while also restoring the color, gloss, and clarity. But something very different happened this time around. Where previously, this process was a way of removing the flaws in my work. This time, this process added flaws to my work. I made one of the worst mistakes you could possibly make when doing this, a mistake I've previously cautioned others from making. While attempting to remove some orange peel on the rear of the dome, I wet sanded either too much or too hard, and burned through not just the clear, but the base coat itself. Normally, this would be a pretty justifiable excuse to be angry and doubtful of your own abilities. I, however, chose to view it as a learning experience, and a teachable moment. There's a lot of good that came from this mistake. Firstly, I would need to reapply clear on this portion of the dome, which gave me an excuse to test out the new settings on my spray gun, which is something I was looking forward to doing anyways. Second, staying true to what I said earlier, how tutorials without transparency are worthless, that is especially true here. The way I see it, if I'm going to showcase a process like wet sanding and polishing, then I think it's my responsibility to show what to do when things go wrong. So what do? The first decision I made was to mask off the opposing side of the helmet. My reason for doing this was that the opposite side was already fully wet sanded, and I honestly didn't feel like redoing all that work. Though I will say that it's probably best practice to not do this, as reapplying clear to the entire helmet is more optimal. Once finished, I used the same 3M Scotch-Brite pad from before to once again scuff the surface, which will provide better adhesion for the new layer of clear. Since I wet sanded through the paint, it's still a smooth surface, meaning nothing needs to be filled. If, for example, this were a scratch, or a more serious type of damage, you would now fill it with whatever filler product you prefer, and sand it smooth. Using the same paint that I applied the base coat with, I decanted some of it into a medicine cup, which was then poured directly into my airbrush. I didn't have enough paint in the can to repaint the entire side of the dome, which is why I opted to do it this way. I built up the color over time, being sure to feather it out across the larger area to make the blend more natural. Since we're using black paint, it's a lot easier to do, but if you were doing this with a brighter, more vibrant color for example, this would be really important, as you could end up with dark spots in the areas you were trying to correct. Once the surface is clean and prepped, only then can we reapply our clear coat. As far as the adjustments made, my PSI was set to around 28, my fan control was about a quarter turn less than full, and my fluid control was 3 complete turns counterclockwise from closed. After spraying 3 coats, what you're seeing now is what the helmet looked like immediately after. I think for most people this would be sufficient enough, and there would be no need to go any further. But because I'm me, and nothing is ever good enough, I went on and reattempted the polishing process mentioned earlier. I once again ran into some issues that I haven't experienced before. In the past, I've used Meguiar's Ultimate Compound and Polish, utilizing a 4-pad process. For reasons that are still unknown, they just weren't getting the job done. After going through the entire process, there was still a very noticeable amount of fine scratches, as well as some haze and lack of gloss all around. I even repeated the entire process twice. I made sure the surface was clean in between applications, I made sure the pads were clean, but still, nothing was working, and the quality wasn't to my standards. I felt a bit sick to my stomach for a few days while I contemplated what went wrong, and why. It seriously bothered me how my previous work had a higher level of quality than the build I was currently working on, especially since my process and technique were the exact same on both builds. In a strange stroke of luck, I read a comment which was recently left on one of my older videos, which recommended several alternative brands of polish that claimed to be of higher quality. I did some research of my own and purchased a new setup. That being Menzerna 400, a heavy cut compound that simultaneously adds gloss, as well as their 3800, which is a finishing polish. What intrigued me the most is how this setup could be applied with only 2 pads, as opposed to 4. I applied their 400 compound using their heavy cut foam pad, which alone immediately removed the scratches and imperfections from before. After this step, I was however left with some discolored hazy spots in some areas, which were luckily taken care of during the next step, which was the 3800 polish. The final results after polishing were honestly nothing short of breathtaking. As mentioned before, I very much internalized the quality of my builds. The inability to achieve the quality I so desperately wanted was having serious effects on my mood. Being able to redeem myself and surpass the quality I was expecting was an indescribable feeling. I'm glad I decided to give these products a try. I will now be using them moving forward when a finish like this is required. All that remains are the smaller accessory parts, such as the lenses, the mouth and chin mesh, and the tusks, all of which were resin printed on my Elegoo Saturn IV Ultra. Starting with the lenses, a buck is included in the STL files, that way they can be vacuum formed. It's extremely important that the surface is as smooth as possible, as the clarity and quality of the lens will directly be determined by that. I prefer to use UV resin when smoothing the surface. UV resin is extremely durable and resistant to heat. I found through trial and error that using printing materials and filler products other than resin tend to warp and deform after a few successful vacuum forms. To make the lenses, I'm using a small vacuum forming machine that's around $120 on Amazon. The lenses themselves are made out of PETG, which I purchased from Cyber Plastic Supply on Etsy, with various sizes and thicknesses available to you. I personally use sheets that are 0.04 inches thick. As always, surface prep is essential. Prior to vacuum forming, it's important that the lens buck is wiped clean and free of any debris. Any imperfections on the surface will be visible on the finished product. While it may not seem like it in the Kenobi series, Vader's helmet does indeed have red lenses, which is most evidently seen in the aforementioned behind the scenes video I spoke about prior. In order to achieve this color, I'll be dyeing the lenses red using iDye poly. Before we can do that though, I clean the lenses with plastics cleaner using a microfiber towel. It's extremely important that you let the temperature of the water cool down to around 140 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Otherwise, you risk warping and deforming the plastic. A helpful tip that was suggested by some of you guys in the comments was to leave an excess of material around the lenses in order to make the process of dyeing them all the more easier. I dip the lenses into the pot of dye for short durations at a time before soaking them in a separate pot of cold water to shock and better maintain the color, repeating this process over and over until the lenses are dark enough. The way you would tell is to simply hold the lens against a dark object. I allowed the lenses to air dry before removing the excess material and once again cleaning the surface with plastics cleaner. The lenses were then secured into place using hot glue. To further reduce the transparency of the lens, I added some black PC fan mesh behind them, which did the trick. Using an airbrush, I painted the remaining parts, that being the mouth and chin mesh, as well as the nose with Vallejo's silver and Alclad's gloss black base. Originally, I planned on painting the tusks that I had resin printed prior, but 19 Props was kind enough to send me an extra pair of machined aluminum tusks that he had laying around. Not only were these a game changer as far as quality is concerned, they were also a huge time saver. It's very tedious resin printing and post-processing parts of this size, not to mention painting them. For that reason, I plan on using real metal parts moving forward. I have a complicated relationship with my past work. My life has been consumed by this constant need to improve, finding better paints to use, better techniques, more efficient ways to post-process, so on and so forth to a never-ending degree. With each day that passes, it becomes harder and harder to look at my work with the pride and triumph described at the beginning of this video. I oftentimes find myself looking at my current and previous work and only see the things I could have done better. Comparison, for the longest time, has been the thief of my joy, a poison that's corrupted every aspect of this hobby that I've come to love, leaving you with this paralyzing feeling of inadequacy. I don't know what it is about making Darth Vader helmets that makes me so emotional. Maybe it's silly of me to say as much, but something changed during the making of this helmet. I've gained new perspective. I've learned to recognize and appreciate the standards of quality I now hold myself to. I look back at my older projects and can now see the evolution that has taken place over the years. I think it's easy to forget how far you've come when you're constantly measuring yourself against someone else's highlight reel. I believe it's human nature to feel discouraged, unworthy, and inadequate upon seeing the work of someone who's extremely talented. Speaking for myself, I don't think that will ever change. I have no control over those feelings when they come. The only thing I can control is what I do in response. I can choose to channel it. I can choose to find inspiration through it. Just because you feel unworthy doesn't mean you have to remain unworthy. Don't see someone else's work as a reason to stop. See it as a reason to begin. You won't always be better than someone else, but you can always be better than who you were yesterday. Continue growing. Keep learning, make mistakes, challenge yourself, and take on projects that are outside of your comfort zone. I believe if we can do that, then there's no limit to what we can do or how far we can go. Comparison is the thief of joy, but only if we let it. That's for us to decide.